Hey everybody, Nicholas here. So I just finished my first episode on Boss Talk Studio with Brandon Craig, and I didn't give him a proper introduction. So Brandon Craig, I met him at church, and he started up Inheritance Pioneers, where he links up with businesses to help them grow and scale, create an exit plan if they're looking to retire. And his goal as a company, well, I'll let him share all that with you. Anyway, he's a great guy. And this is our first episode. So guys, if you like it, share it, comment, whatever, give us some feedback. But for now, let's launch our first episode. Let's get into it. I'm gonna ask you some questions that personally I've wanted to know. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Montgomery, Alabama. Raised there most of my life. I also spent a few years living here with my mom and my stepdad in
Yeah.
Dallas area, and up to middle school, and then I went back to Alabama and graduated high school there.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Stayed there.
Alabama.
Yep.
So I heard you moved down from Washington.
Right.
How'd you end up there?
Yeah. So around 20 years old, I enlisted in the Air Force, and spent almost 8 years enlisted. While I was in, I got my degree and my undergrad, and then became an officer. At which point I spent some time in Florida, and then I went up to Washington State, and that was my last assignment. Was McChord. Well, actually, it was Fort Lewis, so it was, I think, Joint Base Lewis McChord
Yeah.
it's called now, but Seattle area, Tacoma, Washington. Yeah.
What made you want to join the Air Force? What was the deciding factor on that one?
My grandfather was in the Air Force, and so I was and I had an uncle in the Marines, and both of them told me to join the Air Force.
Yeah.
So, it's got the reputation as being sort of the service that offers more job opportunities on the outside.
Yeah.
I don't know how true that is, but it worked out for me pretty well.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's awesome. I have a brother that he served in the Marines for 5 years.
Cool.
I think it was in 2011 when he signed up.
Nice.
And he got out, and now I think he went straight into being a police officer in the police academy.
Okay.
He's been doing his routes for a long time actually, and now I think he's either looking to get into or he's in the SWAT program. So
Oh, nice.
I thought that was really cool. That's awesome, man. That's awesome. Okay, so tell me a little bit about your business. You started up a business, and
Yeah.
it's really fascinating to me. Tell me something about that.
Yeah. Well, I think, I guess most recently, I started a business with my mom, actually. And so, my mom comes from poverty, and my grandfather's passed, and my dad's kind of doing his own thing and has a family as well, and so it's for me, I think this idea of having an inheritance is something I've never really planned on.
Yeah.
We'll see what happens, but the scriptures say in Proverbs, it says a righteous man leaves an inheritance for his grandchildren, and so we started this business to sort of manage an Airbnb we've got running right now, but I know that there's more that I want to do, and kind of saw the opportunity to start it now, and essentially the idea is helping people create an inheritance for their grandchildren.
Yeah.
So we started Inheritance Pioneers, and the idea is twofold. One is to provide an inheritance for my children and grandchildren, and the other is we see a need in the community for small business owners, especially business owners in a lot of the trades have a lot of experience with their trade and their craft, and can create very successful word of mouth businesses, or even do some do pretty good job with even more sophisticated marketing methods and business practices. But when they get towards retirement age, they sort of run into a wall if they haven't spent any time in the industry, in particular in business. Where larger businesses are accustomed to managing lots of personnel and having managers and sort of having boards of directors and having these leadership structures where the shareholders are ultimately benefited even if they aren't working in the day-to-day operations. Small businesses really don't have that, and so they don't tend to know how they're going to retire, apart from maybe selling their business. And even if they sell it, a lot of times they haven't really set it up to be sold to be as profitable as it could be.
Yeah.
So you see these guys getting, pennies on the dollar for what they could get, with a little help, with a little bit of knowledge, and somebody in their corner giving them some more advice on, how to set up for, an exit, an acquisition, or if they want to keep this business going and they want to have a legacy to pass down to their children and their children's children, that, there's ways to set up management structures to enable that as well. And so, I spent some time after the Air Force in consulting for really big firms. I did some stuff, at the Gates Foundation and Microsoft and some other places like that.
Wow.
And I got to see a little bit of that, and I know enough to know that there's some really simple things that you can do to set your company up for success after post-retirement. And so, Inheritance Pioneers is about, for those folks like me who maybe don't have an inheritance coming their way, but who want to be the first generation to offer that to their kids and their grandkids, like I do, and my mom does. We want to help others to do that as well. Yeah.
That's interesting. So when you were actually initially telling me about starting up Inheritance Pioneers, your goal is specifically to help small businesses.
Oh yeah.
Which I consider myself a small business, and
for now, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And hoping to grow that for sure. But what makes you essentially, because you talked about working as a consultant at Microsoft and the Gates Foundation,
mm-hmm.
What essentially did you, and I know we probably can't go into too much detail there, but what makes you, if I'm a small business owner, qualified and have the knowledge that we need to essentially have an exit plan? And
that's a great question. I'd say full transparency. I mean, I'd say that I'm relatively new to this myself, and so one of the things that I've learned over my last, I've only been doing stuff out of the Air Force for the last 6 years, but when I was in the Air Force, I was a Joint Terminal Attack Controller. I was a JTAC.
Oh wow.
And what does that mean? We, in short, we controlled airstrikes for the Army and those kinds of things. But the unwritten stuff that comes along with that is when you get put into positions you don't know how to deal with until you're dealing with them. And so one thing I'd say that makes me kind of uniquely qualified, along with anybody else who's served in those capacities, is nobody knows how to do something until you do it.
Right.
Okay. So I don't have any fear here. Plus, I believe that this is a righteous calling. I think it's something that's needed, and somebody needs to do it. And I'm not one to sort of shy away from challenges. So in general, I believe this is something I'm supposed to do. So there's your starting block, I suppose. The second thing is I did get my degree, and I got my master's while I was an officer in business from Liberty University.
Okay.
So I have a good broad strokes understanding of business in general. I've created several in academia and theory. And then when you get into the bigger organizations, you start to realize that big or small. Right now I work for a tech startup. It's a small company. And I'm running that right now as the CEO. And I've been in that organization for probably 2.5 years now, and there's not a lot of difference really between the enterprise and the smaller businesses when it comes to actually what works and what doesn't.
Yeah.
The big difference is, and the reason that I want to help small businesses is because at Microsoft, if you could save somebody $100 million in a project because you catch an error or something to that effect, or even more.
Wow.
And it's another Tuesday. It doesn't feel like you really helped anything. You didn't really move. I mean, it's $1 trillion organization. Like that's an incredible amount of money to you or me, but it's for them. It's normal. It's typical business. And so they have no problem having just a bloated staff at times that obviously they sort of go back and forth, and I don't want to get into their whether or not they're doing things right. I think they're doing obviously a very good job if they're as successful as they are. But I would just say from a meaningful business perspective, I mean, you get to look your customers in the eye and you get to know that you helped them do something that they needed done.
Yeah.
And I think that to me is just more appealing. So helping small businesses, it's where my passion is. And so with my passion and my sort of broad strokes understanding, my exposure to different sizes of businesses in my career, and then also my work in the Air Force, where I'm just kind of going to go for it no matter what the situation, and have some confidence that, what one person can do, another can do. And I think God's on my side here. Yeah. And so what makes me qualified? I'd say it's a combination of those things.
Yeah, if God's on your side, then who's going to stand against you, right?
That's I
love it.
That's my belief.
See, when I first met you, you were actually visiting at our church, and I actually missed the first day you showed up. I think I was sick or something, and everybody came and was talking to me, and they said, "There's this guy. He's at the church, and he was on the front row, I think, or in the middle of the crowd, and he was just singing and going at it." But when I met you, first time I met you, you actually had long hair. You cut it up, shortened it up. I like both styles, by the way, but you have a different character about you, a different mindset about you, and a different way that you think. And I think it's fascinating. I didn't know what it was at first, and then the more we've gotten to know each other, I know that your mind is a bit more. I wouldn't say, and correct me if I'm wrong, if it was always like that, because I don't know you that well, but it's a bit more analytical. But the way you approach business, for me, because as a small business startup, I just kind of wing it. Like you're saying, you figure it out when you get into it, because I started up tree service business, and because I knew how to do trees, and first I'm climbing, then I'm getting equipment, and now I'm actually learning how the business aspect and side of it, and you're showing that to me, and it's a bit more step-by-step thought out. Is that experience that you gained working with the bigger companies, or did college teach you that, or did experience teach you that?
Good question. I'd have to credit most of that probably to the Air Force. But I think I've learned it in several segments of my life. I mean, in the Air Force, when you're doing close air support, you build your plans based on your desired impact.
Yeah.
Right. So I know I want this effect on the battlefield, so I'm going to work backwards and sort of make my plan to make sure that impact happens when it's supposed to happen and how it's supposed to happen, and they teach you to work backwards from that all the way into the mission planning a couple of days prior. And then you get into I was an instructor in the Air Force for a little while as well, and when you're writing curriculum, they teach you to start with the desired end state for your students. So if I'm trying to train somebody to a certain degree, what is that? Why are you training them to that point? Because they have a job to do when they get out of training. And so you start with the job that they're trying to do, and what are the minimum qualifications needed to be able to do those jobs, minimum capabilities. Then you build your test, and then you say, okay, well, what do I need to do to train for that test? And you work your way all the way back to your lesson plans, but it's backwards. You start with the desired end state. In business school, I think they teach the same thing. And then as a project manager, which was my first job out of the Air Force, working for these consultant firms, it's the same thing. We start with the end in mind, and then you work backwards and you build your plan. So I definitely have been trained that way. That said, I think I have a personal tendency to just sort of I think that's one of my personal characteristics, and maybe somewhat innate. I got out of the Air Force and bought a farm. Never been a farmer before, so I'm like a farmer by YouTube sort of guy.
Okay.
Which is another example of just kind of jump in and see what happens. Which is kind of like what you're doing, right? So it's just go for it.
That's what my dad did.
Yeah.
He came home and we grew up in Indiana. I didn't grow up. He grew up in Indiana, or I think, honestly, I don't know my family's backstory terribly well, but I think he grew up in Indiana, and he moved down to Texas, started a farm, had a bunch of kids,
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Well, yeah, and what you learn out there, or what I was doing is, I'd have these ideas in mind about, I want to put a garden here, or I want to, do this to the barn at some point, or I want to,
Yep.
you always have. I'm a big idea guy, so I always have a vision in mind. What the future is going to look like, and I try to maintain flexibility in that. But at the same time, I do try to keep that in mind when I make changes to my property, for example. And so, it drive my family crazy a little bit sometimes when I'd be, we'd be doing something like installing some utility line, some conduit or something, and I'd be, on a piece of graph paper drawing out the future fence designs and trying to consider all the possible layouts that we're going to have in the future, because I feel like it's relevant before we start trenching to have all of these things sorted out. So like for some reason, my brain just kind of works that way. It wants to figure out the end state before we get started. And so it leads me to a lot of analysis, I think, is kind of get back to your question.
That's interesting. I really think that's interesting. So you essentially will look at, this is where I want to arrive. And then you work backwards from there as to how to get there.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Yeah. I mean, and I think the Bible supports that. It says count the cost before you, go out into an endeavor. It also says, that our plans it might not be God's plan. So I think that there's the strength is always, and I say this to my clients and I say this to my team at work, the strength is in the planning, not in the plan. So going through the planning process and talking that through with your leadership team and knowing what direction you want to go and what your vision and purpose are, those are critical because it helps you make decisions on a daily basis. Doesn't mean that those things aren't going to change, but having an idea where you want to go, I think, is critical.
What made you want to come down to Texas?
Well, my wife is from Dallas, and so that really is what brought us down here. My mother she'd moved up to Washington to be close to us, and she and my brother my brother's from Dallas.
Okay.
She had lived here for a while, and so everybody wanted to come back to Dallas.
Yeah.
And I wanted some land. I don't really want to live in the city if I can help it. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I just like the culture of the country better. And Realtor.com is how I found the property we're on. And I just love the property. And that's how I ended up in Wills Point.
Okay. So now that you're here in Texas and you've been working at your other company, and then you've started up Inheritance Pioneers, what is your goal for your company, say 2 to 5 years from now? Which that's kind of a big, let's narrow it down. Let's say 3 years, 3 years from now.
Okay. Well, let's say, I'd say I know my big goal, kind of a number I've been mulling around for a long time, which is to help 100 small businesses in this county become well established in their community. In the next 3 years, I'd love to be doing this full time, possibly. I like what I do now, and if that takes me more than 3 years to get out, I still love to do what I do now and work for the company I work for. So it just really depends, but I'd love to have seen you really, taken off like a rocket. I'd love to be helping a couple other companies as well by then, maybe sitting on a board or two, if that's a possibility. It's hard to say. There's a saying.
It can go many different ways.
Yeah. Well, and people are. There's a saying that says that people tend to overestimate what they can accomplish in a year, but you tend to greatly underestimate what you can accomplish in 10.
Yeah.
So 3 years, interesting number. I don't know, but 100. I want to just stop at the 100 businesses for a second and explain one kind of aspect I didn't talk about yet with Inheritance. And I think for any listeners who are in this community and are interested in finding some help or even just working on your own business and interested in the concept of establishing an inheritance for your grandchildren. It occurs to me that, I could build wealth financial wealth for my family. And I can pass that down, and it'll be gone when it's gone, and nobody will remember. Right? It's money is just a thing of this
all
world.
All of your hard
right?
work, essentially. Just
I mean, it's
going wherever it goes.
Yeah,
after that,
and I'd say it's of limited value. Okay. Ultimately, you know, there's obviously it's got monetary value, but as far as the things, the eternal things, it's limited in its value, right? It occurred to me that I could build an estate for my daughter and for her children, or my son and his children, and if it was in a community that was just not a very good place to live, i.e., the people aren't good people, then they're not going to want to stay here, and they're gonna leave. And so all of the work that I may put into my land or my property or my home, all of the financial, fortitude that I build into that plan, could end up just getting sold off and they just leave, because I mean, I wouldn't stay here if it was full of, people that I didn't think shared my values and ethics. So I realized that I need to do something in my community to try to safeguard that the best I can. I think there's a responsibility for leaders. If you're leading in your business, I think you have an obligation to also lead in your community, because obviously God's made you a leader. And so I think there's responsibilities when you've been given gifts. And so I want to be a leader in my community. And I think there's a piece of that is, getting into ministry and doing the things, supporting that directly. And I think the other thing was, and this is Inheritance Pioneers, one of the founding principles and reasons, is because I want to establish businesses who are being led by righteous people, men or women, who want to, pass that legacy down to their children and grandchildren, and who are followers of Jesus and who believe in the values and ethics that I support. I want to help them become firmly rooted in this community, so that our grandchildren are all growing up together, and that they're all surrounded by each other, and that this is a place that our grandchildren want to live, and that it really is a legacy and an inheritance for all of them.
I think that's awesome. Whenever you shared that with me, your what would that be? Your value statement, or more of your? Because I'm still learning all that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say it's part of our mission, to establish an inheritance, and that's an economic and community based inheritance. But I also think it's part of my vision. It's kind of how I see the world, would be how I would define a vision. And you ask 10 consultants, you'll get 10 different answers on vision versus mission. But my vision is a community after I'm dead and gone, full of my descendants and your descendants, and everybody sort of carrying on in a community that really knows Jesus, and is financially set well enough to not have to leave, to not be forced out by people who don't have those values, because they are financially capable of maintaining their foothold in this community, and securing its values.
So let me dive into that a little bit. We mentioned faith a lot, and that means a lot to me. We'll share my story a different time, but tell me a little bit about your story, how you came to be a believer and what that means to you.
Okay.
That's kind of a big one, but I really want to know.
I love it. Let us always be ready to give an account for the hope that's in us, right? So, I've had a weird ride in the faith department. I came from not the most challenging circumstances in my childhood, but challenging enough, and certainly didn't really know Jesus. There were moments where I got a glimpse. I grew up in church in a certain brand of a certain denomination. I'm not going to get into that because I don't really support the division there, so I won't say one is more valuable than another. But the one I was in didn't really appeal to me, and it turned out to sort of not be a good enough foothold for me to not run from my faith. And at about 14 or 15 years old, I decided I wanted to subscribe to an atheistic worldview. So for, oh gosh, 7 or 8 years, I think I was
Really?
a self-proclaimed atheist for sure. Yeah.
What led you to subscribe to that?
Um, I think there's a lot of harm um, in abbreviated explanations of Christ. So I was given a very whitewashed sort of what you would call almost like a platitude, and it was once I did an altar call at a FCA camp when I was 14, and because I heard an awesome testimony, got fired up, called down to the altar. It's like, I want that, I want that sort of peace that this guy's talking about. He'd come from drugs and, had a pretty awesome testimony. One of those testimonies that just fires you up, and, ironically, I ended up with sort of that testimony, but I got done with that, and a counselor pulled me aside afterwards, and he said, I'll never forget this. He said, you're forgiven. Do you realize what you've done? You've been now forgiven for everything you've ever done and everything you will do. And I just remember immediately thinking, that doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah.
How could you possibly be forgiven for things you're not sorry for? Now, as a believer now, I can see kind of where the guy's coming from. But more than likely, he was just saying what he'd been told. Right. And maybe not. I don't know. I don't want to speculate. But it
just kind of threw you off.
Threw me off. And then, a couple weeks later, I went home and I wasn't surrounded by believers who believed in sort of born again Christianity. And so I didn't really have a support system for that. And I have a mentor now who told me that it's kind of like, your phone, if you unplug it from the wall, it's going to keep power for a couple weeks, but then, if you don't use it,
it needs to be connected,
but you got to plug it in. Right. So I didn't get plugged in, and, I found myself a couple weeks later doing things that I thought were really simple and were really kind of worse than anything I'd done up to that point. And it just fell apart for me. And I just thought, well, this is all a bunch of crap. I went to the altar call. I professed my belief in Jesus, and, here I am doing things, and there's no way he forgives me for this, or, what? And it's easier to just believe he doesn't exist, right, than to deal with the guilt and the shame and everything that would come from, being a believer and doing the things I was doing at that point.
Yeah.
And so adopted an atheistic worldview. I had a support system for that where I was. I knew some atheists really well, who I cared about a lot and who cared about me a lot. And, you kind of go where you're loved. And that was where I was loved. So I got really good at arguing against the faith. I learned a lot of reasons why not to believe in Jesus. And I like to talk about it. I was very argumentative back then. I really avoid arguments best I can now. But 2006, fast forward a little bit. So I was 14. I was math in public, 98, 99. So 2006, I was in Baghdad, and I was working out with a guy who kept wanting to talk about Jesus. We'd been working out for a couple of months. We were good friends at that point. And he kept wanting to talk about Jesus, and I was like, "Man, I'm not talking to you about this. Like, we're getting along too well."
Pushy about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was, because he was a believer, and he knows what's up, But and he had like a personal healing story. Like he was one of those that like actually had the torn ACL where it's fully separated, MRI, all this kind of stuff, and go back a couple of weeks later after doing a healing ministry prayer, and it's joined, and like the doctors can't explain it and that kind of stuff. This is my first like primary source that I've ever met that had that kind of story. And
he would swear to it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I don't have any reason to doubt the guy. I mean, I really do believe that happened to him. But I didn't know all of that at this time. I just knew that, if I talk to this guy about my beliefs, we're not going to get along anymore. So I don't want to ruin my friendship, is why I'm not talking about this. And, he kept pushing and pushing and pushing. And so finally I'm like, all right, I'll ask you questions, but man, I don't want to piss you off. And so I started asking him the kind of questions that I had that, that are challenging, sort of master's level theology questions. And he didn't know them all, but he would go and spend hours at night researching this stuff and come back to me the next day with some research done and some answers. And I really admired that. And, he was really taking the time. He wasn't going with that short form answer I was talking about earlier. And then, he one day he was like, okay, now it's your turn. I want you to read this book. And he gave me the book Wild at Heart, John Eldredge.
That's a good one.
Mm-hmm. And I think that really sort of changed my worldview on who Jesus was. I mean, it gave me an alternative for sure. And it was the first time I really said, you know what, at first I read it and I was like, well, Eldredge tells you a bunch of things to do in the book, like prayer and stuff. And I was like, I'm not going to pray, but because all of this can be explained by power of positive thought or meditation or whatever.
Right.
And so I'm like, I'm just going to do these things. And then, and they weren't working really. And then one day I thought to myself, as open-minded as I think I'm being by, going with all these alternative, options for what this prayer stuff is, I'm not even giving the prayer stuff a chance. Like how open-minded am I really?
Yeah.
And so I said, well, I'll try it the way he said. And as soon as I started praying, like everything started to change. I started getting, things in my life started to change. People from the other side of the world while I was in Iraq, are calling me up randomly, or we're talking randomly, and I'm finding out that, things are happening in their lives, or they're thinking about me, and they just recently started praying about me, and all these kinds of things are happening, and so I started to go, okay, well, maybe this thing's real, and so I started to kind of believe, and then I went home and immediately lost it. Wasn't plugged in again, got plugged back into my atheist system, and then I went through some challenges. I went through a divorce in 2009, and was just kind of like, you know what? I don't have an excuse now. I really need to just read this scripture for myself and figure it out. And so I started reading the Bible, and I'd say 2009 is really where I started trying to follow Jesus. And since I've done that, my whole life's changed. I mean, I've still run into challenges and problems and things, but since I've really kind of made Jesus not just my Savior, but the Lord of my life, I've grown in maturity. I've still suffered from terrible setbacks and challenges. But I've also just seen overwhelming joy in those times of hardship that are inexplicable apart from Christ.
Yeah.
And I can also say that, when you follow Jesus, you really you have access to a whole different set of tools. You have access to peace that people don't have. You have access to hope that people don't have. And I think you still go through the attacks, you still go through the challenges, and I've had some doozies, by the way. Like I'm not a saint by any. Well, I mean, I am a saint, right? But I'll own that. But I mean, I'm not what I thought a saint was.
Right.
I'm not a somebody.
No show, but in his eyes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, like we're all saints of but I'm not. Nobody's going to be nominating me to be Saint Brandon of anything. So. And I know that he's got me, and I also, and I didn't talk about this, but I went through a bout with drugs, pretty severe, and I've gone through my share of addictions and my challenges with alcohol and my challenges with anger, and I've and just a couple years ago, I joined Celebrate Recovery in Washington, and really got to know that the only reason I'm standing here, the only reason I'm sitting here is because of Jesus. Like I have no reason for surviving the things that I've been through, other than His grace and His mercy and His providence. And I believe that there's a reason for that. I think that He's given us purpose who are still breathing, all of us. And I think if you woke up this morning, then that's the gift. Life is the gift. And I think we lose sight of that. We live our lives and we think that there's got to be more. We need more purpose. We need more blessings. We need more. I think waking up and existing on this beautiful planet that He created, presumably because He thought we might enjoy it. I've grown to just really appreciate that. And I would think if we're given that each day, that there's something He wants us to do with it.
Let me ask you something. So you had a bout with drugs, and I know a little bit about that. I don't know a whole lot. I personally have had a bout with drugs, a pretty bad one, and something I've noticed bringing it back to business is I know a lot of business owners, and we're not talking about the ones that currently struggle with it. That is for sure a temptation. But a lot of business owners I know of that used to be ex-drug addicts that get straight through one means or another, and end up going into career of entrepreneurship or business and moving that path. And they tend to be very, very successful. I have a hypothesis that drug users have this compulsive obsession to obsess over certain things, and then thus leading to an addiction, not only the physical addiction, but like a mental, like just obsession a little bit about things. And that can transfer over very well into business. I believe we're created, and also bringing faith into it, I believe we're created to be obsessive beings to a degree. Not in a non-peaceful kind of way, but I think we're supposed to be obsessive about Jesus and about God.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if we're not careful, we could. So the Bible refers to it as idols, making it your idol.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the word I'm actually using is not necessarily like obsession, but more of like idolizing. What you let control your daily thought and being and whatnot. I don't know, but
no, I think you're spot on. I love at the Celebrate I started at, they love to say you can't overdose on the Holy Ghost.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that there is an outlet for we who obsess. It's interesting. I was told that Harvard did a study. I don't know if I actually saw the study, but I believe this to be true. And they were seeking out the most common demographics to who were successful entrepreneurs, and they discovered that it's immigrants and felons. And essentially the rationale that they discovered was that it's people who don't have the ability to earn, really high wages by any other means. So if you have limited opportunities to go make the $200,000 a year at wherever, because you're a felon and it's going to be hard to get a job, then the only way to make that money is do it yourself. You have to start your own thing. Immigrants similarly, sort of show up and maybe they're not as they don't feel as employable, or they find any sort of discrimination or anything like that happening. And so what do? They start their own things, and they also support each other. And I think that's probably true in the communities of ex-drug users and believers and things. I think we want to support each other. I think if you see a Christian business person that's got a background like that's similar to yours, you want to give them a shot, right?
Right.
I also think that everything that you see that you would call a flaw, and I don't think God makes us with flaws exactly.
Okay.
I don't think that he made a mistake when he made you or me who have had challenges with addiction. I think that the addiction is a corruption of a positive attribute that he created.
Okay.
And I think that's the enemy using our good things against us. So you have, go ahead.
No, sorry, go ahead. Finish it.
Well, you have your you called it obsessive, but you have your tenacity. You might call it. You have your the strength that you have to really sink your teeth into something and take it to the finish line and really go 100 miles an hour in a direction. I don't know what you would call that exactly, but I can corrupt that. If I'm Satan, maybe I can corrupt that by pointing you to this other thing that's bad for you. Yeah. Whereas if you were to point that at Jesus, you'd find yourself to be hyper successful.
Yeah. See, I think we were created to be, well, I know we were created to be stewards. Mm-hmm. We're created to work. I don't believe that that's something. If you're not doing that, I think you're missing some of your potential peace and happiness. If you're not working or stewarding over something, if you don't have anything to do, if you're bored or not over something, I think you can definitely feel a lot of like what's missing. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like we are more happy. I'm more driven, more excited, more fired up when I'm doing something and I'm in control of something in a stewardship kind of way. And I don't know. For me, when I was doing drugs, a part of it was, for one, I had to be the best. So if I was going to do something, I had to be the best at doing it, and not in a dealing kind of way, but in a intaking. Like I wanted to try everything. I wanted to know what everything did. I want all these different things, and I wanted to try every drug, and I wanted to see how far I could push the ticket
Mhm.
and push my limits and whatnot. And I think that's transferred a little bit over to business and also to faith, because I've what kills me the most. I guess what I'm trying to say is, what kills me the most is there are people that don't have that,
Mhm.
and they get satisfied, or don't they get comfortable, you know, and they live a life of comfortability of set. And so maybe you don't do drugs,
Right.
but you're good all your life. And even for somebody that maybe wants to start a business, and that's a good idea, and they want to start a business, but they never accelerate or grow, it they settle at a certain level.
Yeah. A lot of interesting points there. First and foremost, I'd say the only thing we should be pursuing with the level of tenacity that we're talking about is Christ. I want to make that real clear. Like
Yeah.
I think that you called it, sort of making things your idol earlier, and you can really easily do that with a business. You can do that with your family. Parents will make their kids their idols. People will make their spouses their idols. I think I've been guilty of that at times. And all it does is end up alienating and pushing people away, and it never works, right? And if you focus on your business as your idol, then inevitably it's going to not work. So I think you have to focus on Christ first and foremost. But I think you can do that in every single thing you do in life. I don't think it means you have to go to church all the time. I think it means that you can, do it in your business. I think you can do it at your home. I think you can do it everywhere, right? So I would point that out at first as sort of just my perspective on things. And then I'm trying to remember. You said something else that was really interesting.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I kind of got us out on a rabbit trail. We took a rabbit trail hard there, but it was good.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure it'll probably come up if it's meant to.
Yeah. Okay, so let me. What do you think? Taking it back to the business aspect, and this, I really like your story, your testimony. That's really cool. And we'll get some more into that maybe another time if you come back on.
Okay.
But so, from personal experience, what is a mistake you see small businesses making that keeps them from accelerating and keeps them from seeing the progress that they want, that actually may improve their lives and their business in functioning? What do you think is something that they could do or don't do that hinders them?
Yeah, well, I'll give you two. I'll give you two things that I can think of, and the first one is this: always do what's right. Okay, so one thing that'll kill your business, kill anything in your life is when you decide to do something that is not right. It doesn't mean you're going to make perfect mistakes all the time, or make perfect decisions all the time. You will make mistakes, but when you recognize those mistakes, adjusting and deciding I'm going to do what's right now. Right, I've been made aware of this issue, and I'm going to change course. Right, so but never make a decision that to be wrong. Okay. Ethics are critical.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of scripture to point to describe why that's critical. There's a bunch of business studies where there's ethical companies versus unethical companies, and longevity of their businesses, et cetera. Then and ethical companies last longer. Okay. Period. The second thing is I think pride is probably the biggest mistake you can make, and so being humble, being a continuous learner, acknowledging what you don't know, finding help outside of you. All of those things have to do with humility and avoiding pride at all costs. and that's the other big thing. I mean, and it covers just a gamut. One of the reasons I believe you're going to be successful, and why it's really awesome to I feel like I've got front row tickets to watch you just sort of become a really big influencer in this community, is because you're very curious. You're a learner, that's obvious, but you're also willing and ready to take advice from others, and that is where your strength is. When I was training, TACP was my actual job in the Air Force, and it's called Tactical Air Control Party.
Okay.
And when I was training apprentice TACPs in technical training at Hurlburt Field, which in the Army it's called like AIT or Advanced Individual Training. I'm not sure what the Marines call it, but that's where you learn to do your job in the Air Force. You leave basic and you go to this school. Mm-hmm. And it's a pretty intense school, and a lot of folks fail out. You got, I think we had a 50-something% attrition rate and like an 80% washback rate. So very few people, 20%, are going to make it straight through without having to recycle and repeat phases.
Okay.
And only half are going to make it all the way through at all. That's not like the single digits of the SEALs or pararescue or something, but it's a pretty high attrition school. But and I don't tell you that for any other reason than to say that we tried to help airmen who were going through that training get through it by teamwork. And what we would teach is, if you're the only person looking after your stuff, you'll probably fail. But if you are checking, the equipment of your other 10 teammates, then those other 10 teammates are checking your stuff as well. So you can either be the one person checking your stuff, or you can have 10 people checking your stuff. But that means you got to be outside of yourself, and you got to be supporting the team.
Wow.
And so I think for a business owner, a lot of these kind of fundamentals hold true. You need a team. You may be the kind of person who can do everything to some degree of success. I think that's perfectly fine. I know it to be possible. But I know you'll probably be exhausted. You'll probably burn out, and you're not going to be as good at some things as the experts are going to be. And so being willing to, hire some things out, accept a little less in your margin, and gain the expertise of the, outsourced labor from your marketing team or your accountant or your legal expert that keeps you from, losing your business from a lawsuit or something like that. I mean, bringing in those experts and being humble enough to listen to them and do what they say, I think that's, apart from doing the right thing, I think that's the next best thing you can do.
Wow. I appreciate you coming on this podcast. Thank you so much. Yeah,
it's been awesome.
I definitely want to have you back on. I feel like you've got a whole lot more to share in your brain. I want to get it out to the world and the community to see it. And I really am, dude. I could talk about this stuff all day.
Yeah, it's fun. So, I like it too.
Appreciate it. Thank you for being on Boss Talk Podcast. We're going to have some more content, some more people on the show. If you would like to be on this show, if you're a business owner like Brandon in Van Zandt County area, and we can even expand past Van Zandt County. I'm not limiting it to Van Zandt County. But if you'd like to be on this podcast, DM me, comment, share this if you liked it, if you enjoyed it. Thank you very much. This is the Boss Talk Podcast.
Awesome.
All right. Thank you, man.
Thanks, Nick.